So, who heard my explanation? Who did not hear my explanation of what a fishbowl conversation is? Okay. Well, you've been to a fishbowl, though, right? NDSA. So, no? Okay. So, follow along. You know, basically, 3 people are going to come up here. We're going to start the conversation. And then tonight's topic is debugging. How do you solve problems? So when you run into an issue at work or personally, etc., the software development in general, how do you approach problems? So at work, oftentimes it might be a ticket that you get, like EDO or some sort of bug tracking system. What's your first steps to addressing those issues? What about when you don't know, when you don't have a ticket, you just know that there's a bug? How do you track it down? Are there development practices that you follow to prevent needing to debug hard in the first place? Do you have, for example, documentation, etc.? I'm just throwing ideas around there. Unit testing, integration tests, system tests, and so forth. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. So let's get the first. I'll sit down first, and then with 2 other people, and we can just start talking about it. Anyone else? We got 1 more seat. Now, does everyone know the rule? If you want to talk, you have to come up here. It's a group discussion only to the extent that the people over here are talking. Then, you just come up and you'll see people leave. Unless they don't want to. You have to fight to the death. But usually it doesn't end up like that you remember last year. Surprised anybody made it out alive. It was a tough funeral. Oh no, he was alive though. He shouldn't bury people out there.
The reason why I wanted
Hey.
So the reason why I wanted to come up here today is because I wanted to start with just a preface to this, in a sense. I feel like if you're really gonna, before you get into debugging, as a newer developer, as an aspiring developer, I hope to just impart this to some of the other people here, that really understanding your tools, I feel like can help right at the beginning. And just taking some extra time out of your day to just understand the tools that you're working with. And even just, see some, like look up a video on YouTube, even if it's just like, some of the hottest extensions you can get for VS Code, depending on what language you're working with. Even basic things like that don't hurt. So I just wanted to add that. So if anybody wants to chime in, I'll be the first to drop out.
But this is very true. So this is something that I've found. We were just having a conversation on Teams about this. Some people noticed, in Visual Studio, you can actually just drag the arrow and make that the next line of code that gets executed and just skip logic. I was like, yeah, I knew about that, but I never really talked about it. I rarely used the feature, but these people are blown away that was something that exists. And and I remember when I learned about that, I'm like, oh, that's cool, and then I never used it. But that's something that's fascinating. Just like from time to time, go read the Visual Studio documentation around its debugging toolset. The stuff that's built in, and Dave can't talk right now, but ReSharper has a lot of these amazing capabilities that end up getting built into Visual Studio that I used to use all the time. I'm looking forward to some of these being built in that I still use ReSharper for, but oh my gosh, the things that, if you know the keyboard shortcuts, how much more productive you can be. And then the number of free extensions, on top of that, because your Visual Studio, Visual Studio is like Microsoft Word for Office, right? It's to developers what Microsoft Word is for Office. And at least for C# .NET developers, there's so many free utilities and free extensions that don't suck, that just make your life easier, and some are cheap. Like ReSharper is not free, right? But you can get a lot of utilities that do some of the ReSharper stuff, or just use what Visual Studio already has. Ozcode isn't free, although we're going to give a license away tonight. But Rev Debug is. And it does some of the stuff that Ozcode does, and in some cases even more. I'll get into that one later. But it's fascinating, just how our tools make our lives easier when it comes to debugging.
Really understanding those tools and taking time, even if you feel like you already know enough about them, just because I used to do editing. I used to do writing, copy editing, and what I noticed is that you need to review the rules of grammar if you're going to do that, at least every once in a while, because you're going to come across something where it's like, if I just reviewed a little more, I would have immediately known how to correct an issue. And I imagine that from my experience and from what I've been hearing, that with software development, it's basically the same process.
Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to this.
From more of a vanilla perspective in terms of the tools, like I haven't really thought to reach out to, acquiring plugins or anything like that. So just the general way that I would approach a problem, is to hear about it online, go replicate it to, and then put in a breakpoint, see what it looks like. Put in a breakpoint, see what it looks like. Progress through, iterate through.
Commenting outlines, I think, is always a good approach too. At least in my case.
As long as you don't check it in.
I work more with JavaScript, so.
As long as you don't check it in.
That's fair.
There's no faster way for me to refuse or reject a pull request than for me to see commented out code. I don't care if it's a hot fix that needs to be in production right now. If I see commented out code, it ain't getting in. Because no one will understand what that was for later on. But yeah, to your point, how do you approach it when it's not so easy to reproduce? Because that's something that I find, especially like junior developers, any junior developers here, really at the beginning you're kind of taught, oh hey, just write code, that's all you need to know. But no, you really need to be a good problem solver. If you can't debug your code, your life's going to be very difficult as a developer, because most of the time you're not writing your code, you're fixing it. And it's oftentimes not code that someone else, or that you've written. It's just someone says something is broken and I need it fixed now. And they give you no context, they give you no detail, they don't give you repro steps. It's like, oh, this is broken, go fix it. That's usually what I get on a day-to-day basis if something's broken. This is broken, and I didn't even write the code, nor am I familiar with what the business rules are. So it's fascinating to me. How do you start that process?
Well, I have a completely different question, to be honest. But you seem like you want to get in here, so go for it.
Did everyone see what just happened? Peaceful transition of communication. And this is how it works. So if you want to talk, this is like.
I mean, wouldn't the thought process be if you're just like handed something and there's a problem in it, you're just gonna try to narrow down the scope? You just like, okay, well, I can't just read through this entire thing. Maybe narrate like just with some, educated guesses. Be like, well, it might be here, here, and here. Let's check this function.
Right. Usually what I do, and it all depends on the application, right? So if it's an application I wrote, I usually have a lot more context as to what might have gone wrong. Right. If it's an application I'm very familiar with, I generally know where to look. Okay, so I know like the debugging practices, how to drill down to problems. But the first thing I usually do is not touch the code. I'll think about the code, just quick mental scan. Might this be a code problem, or might this be something else? Sometimes it's not code. Sometimes it's an expectation issue, or it's something that our code is processing. For example, I have to consume a type of file that has definitions of what we need to build every single day. The code may be doing exactly what it's supposed to do, and blowing up because of it. And then I either have to go to the person who made that hack that I need to process, and sometimes I need to punt and say, hey, at first glance, I think this is your problem, not mine, and then see if they can confirm that before I go down the rabbit hole of code.
Right.
And then if they come back and say it's definitely not a content issue, or a pack issue, etc., then I go and I look at it. So my first question is not to assume it's code.
Yeah.
Where could this go wrong? And actually, I just ran into that today. The pack was right. The code was right, but it was still blowing up. But thankfully, we had really good logging, and I saw the error, and
I was able to, go into the code to exactly what had that error message, and where it throws something like that, and I was like, oh, I see. It was just, it assumes that like one of 4 values will exist and not this 5th, even though the 5th is a totally valid one. It wasn't a valid option when this was originally written. I'm guessing. This is my guess, right? What happened is always an interesting question. And then I was able to fix it and go through all the motions of getting to QA and then eventually prod, etc. But yeah, the first approach was not code, other than mental scheme.
Right. And that, I mean, leads to...
I know, it's surprising.
The thought of just building code very workable by other people, right? Like logging is just so valuable. I've been told, I'm kind of new, but that test-driven development is like a hot topic.
Yeah.
The idea of like building out tests first prior to building out the code, and I feel like that could also help a lot of debugging, just knowing.
Yeah, I have found that to be insanely useful for key business components. So like things where I need to verify algorithms are working or communication between systems is proper. That's where I'll go write the unit and the integration tests. I'm not someone who believes in 100% code coverage. I find that if I had unlimited budget and unlimited time, I could do that. Now, I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm often working in systems that don't have any unit tests. Or if they have unit tests, it's really they add unit tests. Nobody maintains them, nobody runs them. It was a good idea at the time, and then no one stuck with it. And as an application goes from team to team to team, and the developers change, you'll see the unit tests aren't always kept up to date. But I love it, right?
Yeah.
Like it's great where it's useful.
Right.
And then if you have a team that believes in it, it's great. It doesn't solve all your problems. And I'm not 100% sure that it'll find bugs that you didn't know to test for.
Yeah.
So you can find where tests are failing, and if the tests are failing, then okay, you know where to go, right? Because you can very quickly see what's being injected through your container, and what function's being called, and you're seeing what the message was about what failed. Okay, now you have something you can figure out. But what if you for example, my thing with the 5 different values. I mean, maybe the test was missing. What happens when you send something that's
Hasn't been included.
that isn't included? Well, that doesn't update a business requirement. That if it suddenly became a new value that was available and no one knew that unit test existed and no one was running the tests or updating the tests, no one would have known to update that particular test, and then a year later someone runs the test, says the system's broken, tries to fix it, but actually it's already been fixed.
Like a situation where this, like running a test would have been helpful. My application is during like early development of the game that I'm working on, I sent HTTP requests that are enormous. So it takes a while for Visual Studio to keep up. I have a really good computer. If I inspect an object, it may take like 30 seconds to actually unravel and see IDs of characters, etc. So I had this really crazy bug where the IDs of the characters were not being matched appropriately over the course of the battle, and it just happened at some random point in the battle using status effect, blew up whatever on the server side. So he sent it down, and then you don't know, is this bug on the front end or the back end? And so, I solved it once. Well, he solved it on the back end. I haven't figured it out though. And then it came back again, and I was just thinking like, I should have wrote a test for that. If anybody else wasn't working on this, they would know about it.
Right.
It's just from the experiential.
So something I've been playing around with. So logging, yes, yay. And there's so many cool tools out there for logging. So if you're building apps, you definitely need to check out App Center, Microsoft's App Center. It'll automatically log every exception in your application, tell you the trends. It's all in a really nice portal. It's free, and you can actually assign ADO tickets, Azure DevOps tickets, right from App Center. It's very amazing. If you haven't been there, go to appcenter.ms. It'll change your life if you're an app developer. Then, of course, Application Insights. If you haven't used that, that's a great logging solution. It stores up to like 1 gigabyte for free, which I mean is probably enough, and it gives you less overhead than paying for like a SQL instance just for that sort of stuff. Because if you're just doing lightweight logging, then who cares? That being said, and one other thing about App Center, which I'll probably talk about this at the Xamarin meetup sometime in the next like 6 months, is it has user flows. So you can actually track events, and it'll say user went from performed this action, then 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 this action, and it'll map it out how they use your application in a graphical flow. So you can see if people end up getting to like the shopping cart and drop.
Do you have to correct code for that? Like set attributes?
Yeah. Well, no, there's not just attributes. You just mark events. Yeah. And then I think, I'm not sure if the navigation events. No, you have to do it through events. But I could show you. I could show you on. You'll see it. You're like, oh my gosh, it's super easy. You just say analytics log event, and then you can pass just a anonymous type of whatever you want, and it'll automatically track those. It's very cool. It'll tell you who's installed your app across which versions of Android and iOS, etc., and your install rate and who's running into problems on which versions. It's amazing. It's all free. It used to be called Hockey App. If anyone's heard of that, this is what Microsoft has transitioned to.
Google Analytics is another one that does similar things. Although you embedded in code, I don't know if they have attributes.
This doesn't use attributes. It's code. Yeah. So I'm sure Google Analytics does it too. I just used this one and it was cool. So the other one that I found that I've been playing around with is it's a DevOps server. It's from RevDebug. That's one of the sponsors. But RevDebug will record your entire debugging session. And then when you're done debugging, it becomes a playable application instance. So you can actually step through your entire application runtime, like the entire time you were debugging, and it'll mark on a map where all the exceptions might have occurred. And you can tap, it'll take you directly to that code, the values of all the variables at that time. And it's free.
Can you cache that layout? Use it on different iterations of it?
So they have 2 versions of it. One is the one that works locally, that's free. The other one is the one that's not free, that's a server. And it will integrate into Visual Studio and show you all the recordings for the current build that you have, and then you can open those recordings and check them. Yeah. So if anyone ever wants a demonstration of how that works, let me know. They presented once here, RevDebug, but I don't know if we have a copy of that recording, because I think it was before we started recording. But wow, it's really cool, because how often do you get that message of, hey, it broke, but you don't know, like, oh yeah, it broke yesterday, we had a crash. Well, how do you recreate that? Like your thing with the game, well, maybe I wrote a unit test, but that doesn't matter. It's after the fact, things in the field. How do you reproduce that one weird scenario where the user had an issue? And RevDebug did that. It just, I can just go and say, oh yeah, hey, that's how I noticed we were having a whole bunch of out-of-memory exceptions. That's how I found out that we had a configuration error in a logging solution that would cause a worker role to die, because it was failing inside of the catch. So it would throw the exception, kill the whole process, and the worker role restarts, right? Because it was an uncaught exception in the worker role, so it recycles. Well, that gets expensive. That's bringing down the whole system. I never would have known had I not seen that, because you don't see worker roles recycling. You get notifications,
Right.
but you don't know why, right? It just says, God forbid it be an asynchronous function, right? And you just get that awesome message that says it's on await or move next. And how many people have seen that one? Await or move next. So, and that's how, and I finally learned about how that's a state machine. and that's what that was from, is it's going through all the tasks it needs to unwind before it can send back to the context, and now I understand why that message exists. I never knew what it was for until I read about how async await works. But yeah, like logging, oh my gosh, that's the next thing you go to. We have religious logs in the systems, and like App Center, it's logging, it just absolutely changes your mind, or it changes your life, because that's, if you don't know, where it occurred,
Right.
But like the stack trace, that's the other thing that I found it's useful to go through, but sometimes it's a lie. How many people here have an issue with? Have you ever used? Do you use get base exception, or do you always just look at the exception?
I am following the exception.
Yeah, just look at the exception too.
Yeah. So always try, and you gotta come up here, man. No, you can't leave until someone takes your spot. Yeah. So this is something I find with a lot of people is they don't call get base exception on the exception that they received. And so here's the error. Actually, no, that was an error way up the stack.
Right.
You need to get the base exception that called it, or that caused it. So yeah, all you gotta do is say .get base exception. Yeah. And you'll be like, oh my gosh, I never got the base exception. That's why I never fixed it.
You have a question, actually, since I'm not up here again. From my understanding, re-architecting an application is something that you're going to have to potentially deal with with a legacy code. So I would imagine that in that circumstance, debugging is going to go hand in hand with that process. Is that fair to say? If so, could you elaborate on that?
Well, when it comes to re-architecting an application, I wouldn't start with code. Something that I found that a lot of developers, especially like junior and intermediate, do, and I think you and I have talked about this before, is they start with code. And I find you have much more approachable solutions when you start with intent. So, building interfaces first that kind of mock out. Hey Siri, call 911. That's my favorite. I'm gonna keep just randomly dropping that. Hey Siri, call 911. Did it do it again? Cool. Hey Siri, call emergency services. This is great. It's okay. No one's said anything to Google yet. Please don't, because they'll stop the recording. So if you were re-architecting an application, that is debugging architecture. So I don't know if I would go. I'm not sure I would start with what the application does right now, or with the code structure. I would start with what's the application supposed to do, and understand that, and get a high-level understanding what the current application does, and figure out the delta of where you are and then where you want to go.
Yeah.
It depends though. Like rarely have I seen a whole. It depends how big the application is. Rarely do I see a whole hog re-architect of an application, unless they have the time and money to do it.
Right.
And usually it's phased. Chances are, if you're re-architecting, it's been around for a long time, and still most likely I think. It was written in more of a rush than people had wanted in the beginning, and you have to re-architect in mind that you're probably going to reuse some of the code. But the cool things that you can do is that's where like interfaces and stuff come in handy. Start building out the interfaces that mark up your intent, and then that way, as the system's being rebuilt, I mean, it's a big process. You can start with like fakes and see how the different pieces work together, and then of course you have much more testable code because you can inject mocked-up objects that give your expected. What happens when I call this function? It returns this result. Well, a mock will do that for you. Yeah.
So it's a lot like how you said you tackle debugging. I would start with code. You just look at it on a more service level first and understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I just try to figure out when I debug, which is everyone has their own approach. I mean, I definitely use the tools. The first thing I do is I try to make it crash. Like I try to reproduce it, and then the first thing I do before that is I turn off CLR exception handling. So, do you know where the exceptions dialog is in Visual Studio?
No.
Speaking of knowing the tools.
Not off the top
So
of
if
my
you go to Windows and then Developer and then Debugging, or no, Exceptions. I'm trying to remember exactly what it's called, but it's Exceptions. One of the options that will be a box will say Common Language Runtime Exceptions. And by default, it won't be fully checked and it won't be unchecked. It's that weird like middle state, because some are checked and others aren't. You want to uncheck that. And basically what it'll do is it'll, even if an exception is going to be handled, it will stop the debugger on any exception when it's thrown, regardless of whether it's handled. Because oftentimes I find exceptions getting swallowed. You actually don't know that there's a problem occurring because you don't see it. There's no exception, therefore there's no bug. That's not true. You might be swallowing an exception and then leaving the application in a bad state. And then the code after that is expecting something to be to exist, and oh, oops, it's not. And that's a problem because oftentimes I see people write bad data tiers which don't validate any of the data going into the tier. They just pass it through. They don't care. Yay, entity framework. Oh, damn it. No more pizza for me. But yeah, that's the issue. That's one thing that I use to immediately get to. Are there any caught exceptions that really are causing my problem?
I'm just going to talk about bugs in a more general sense. Is like bugs is kind of like our psychological warfare in a way. Because what I mean by that is, if you have a bug to solve, that's fine. If you have 3 bugs to solve, that's fine. What if you have 20 bugs to solve and you've got more bugs coming in than you can solve?
Well, I think Auri really put it best. It kind of depends on your situation. It kind of depends on who you have working on the project. And
Right.
ultimately, at that point, once you know what you're working with, you then prioritize and review. What's the worst thing that I feel like I can address the quickest?
Sure.
And then you work down that way.
I was also going to say that I see a lot of bugs and worked on a lot of various types of bugs and tools. But bugs, I think, are symptoms of the pathology of the organization that you're in. And what I mean by that is, like, are they rushing you? Are quality? Are they providing the training? Do they identify development of the developers? So when you go into a bug fixing scenario, it's often good, like you said, not to start with the code. Take a few minutes and do research, and if you can find who wrote the code, perhaps they have a style or a trend that they use that you will find that they're making bugs like this often.
I can imagine, yeah. Especially with newer developers, especially because I'm often working with people who are aspiring developers. There's a higher chance that when you don't know what you're doing and you don't feel confident in what you're doing, that you're just going to make mistakes all over the place. And you're not going to notice things. I was just working with some guys who were building the Twitter clone actually, and they had this problem. Even their product owner, who was just trying to help people with building out components for React, was just like it was just all over the place. They knew more than I feel like they were willing to give themselves credit for, but the problem is they were just kind of under the pressure of not knowing what they're doing. It's the first time they're actually building something like this, architecturally speaking. So they would constantly just make different. By the way, if you want to add to this, Derek, please just hop on up here. Because
I have.
Oh, you can't talk yet.
Well,
He
you
has
want to finish your
so-
point
yeah.
before we?
Yeah, just go for it because you can do a better justice than I can.
I actually wanted to go back. I think the point that he was getting at, we're both coaches at Indy Academy, and so sometimes people get caught up thinking they don't know something when really they do. And that is helping them to relearn what they already learned is one issue with teams that I've worked with. I actually want to come up here so I can rewind for a minute. I think you made an interesting point about how sometimes companies might rush somebody or the quality of the
teamwork is rough. And I think you make good points about how there's a business interest, like they have so much money and they have so much time. Where is our product? So where's the middle ground there? I think I might have heard you going more toward logging than testing.
No.
Okay, yeah, my thought on that was like, you're not testing.
If testing is available, then great. But you're not always going to run into a project where tests were the thing, and you might also have time. Some people say, well, there's always time for tests. I go, then you need to go work for a consulting firm. So there are two things I wanted to bring up just before I forget them. One, I've been in your situation when you have a deluge of bugs. What you do have to remember is that given limited resources, you simply have to prioritize and then realize it's not magic, it's code. And this too will pass and you have to take it one at a time. And like I ran into this in the past day. I mean, I'm one developer for a global project. And I mean, I can't just go get another resource, even though I got dozens of developers around. So I just go and I take the list. I go, what's the most important thing that I have to work on? And I take it one at a time. And I'll work on that. Now, sometimes I may get stuck. If I get stuck, I check that in or I stash it. I create another branch and I go and I hit a low-hanging fruit. And like something I just to change gears. Sometimes you have to do that. And so keep that in mind, that it's okay. Bugs are going to stack up. Some bugs are going to get fixed, some aren't. It's possible. Depends on your backlog. At the same time, it's one thing at a time. Now, if you're on a team, maybe a team of 2 or a team of 5 or a team of 7, sprints and setting expectations and so forth, that helps deal with that preventing developer PTSD. But
burnout.
it's a real thing.
Oh,
The other things that you have to consider, and I haven't gotten to my second point yet, but you're really paid for like 40-ish hours a week. Recognize when you need to stop and take a break, and recognize that the day will end, and you can work on things fresh tomorrow. And I found that to be refreshing, because the people that go and work like 12 hours are like, oh, just one more thing. It's never ending, and you burn yourself out, and then you're worthless the next day because you just spent the whole night, trying to track down a bug, when really what you needed to do is you needed to step away from it. The other thing is, if you have a team of more than one, talk with other, bounce your idea off other people and say, here, could you give me a sanity check on my approach? Or identify the developers in your organization or on your team. Like there's certain people in my organization that are better at certain types of bugs than I am. And I know it. I know that this person has dealt with this same problem because we were on a team before and they dealt with authentication issues all the time. Sure. Well, I'm a good developer, but they know authentication.
One thing.
So if you know OpenID really well,
sure.
And I don't, I'm gonna be like, hey, can I go get so-and-so on this team and have them at least look at it?
Yeah, I mean, asking for help can be hard to do.
Yeah.
Can pay off. One thing to talk about in terms of actual tools specifically, logging is a force multiplier. Unit tests are not. Unit tests are more work. Typically they can solve problems and hopefully they're like future problem solvers, but they're a big investment. Logging, you can drop logging into an application in an hour. And it will pay off the entire development of that application.
Yeah. I guess my concern was when I don't know the balance between the two. I'm actually just getting into logging, and it's, I prefer testing personally. I think they should go hand in hand, but it's the future developers. Like when I'm coming into a project and I can't find that developer, and I can't say how did you get started with this and why did you leave me with this repo?
There's a high likelihood that they will abandon those unit tests. The likelihood of abandoning logging is significantly less.
Debugging is an exercise in log reading. It's as simple as that. There is something. We've had nothing but conversation of tools upon tools upon tools. It's all necessitated by the obscene levels of complexity that we unnecessarily build into our software. Logging is the one sure way to find what a problem is. Like you can put unit tests galore. To Auri's point, a new value is going to creep in. It's valid. Nobody ever thought about it when that unit test was written. It's going to fail, and somebody, whatever you're integrating with, they're going to inject a new value. Your shit's going to break. You know what's going to find it? The log when you wrote out what that value was. We have our system. We did have the good fortune of going through a re-architecture of the application fairly recently. We're still working on it. It's been about 2 years in development, replacing a system that existed for about a year that was rushed. It was not logged. Like, we couldn't tell when a user was created in that system. So we log to the extent of excess, but I can tell you exactly who did what when with which version of our client at any given time. I can tell you volume tracking, like we play audio in location-based businesses. We have advertisers paying to be on our network. It's very important to them that their paid advertisement is heard in that space. I can tell you what the location volume was at that time because of the logging that we built into the system. So we track all of that. We track all of this information coming in. We have logs for servers and what our HTTP requests coming in are. When it comes down to tracking down a bug, I don't have to guess where to start because I've already got the log that tells me exactly what happened. So when I hear things like there are great tools out there, don't get me wrong, but I find that in my 20 years of experience doing this, everything boils down to read the freaking log. If you don't have logs, you're never going to find the problem. And P, you're going to get these bug reports like something happened, and then you're going to get these bug reports like this happened, and I think it's because of X, Y, or Z, which has nothing to do with the actual problem. The only definitive answer is what the logs say, because the logs are going to capture that history. You don't have to retain the logs indefinitely. Unit tests are only going to capture what you test for. The logs are going to capture the source of truth of what was going on at that time.
Right. And you can, for one of the applications we have logging, we're paying 50 cents a month for your application insights. When you tune it right, it's less than $10 a month tops. There's no, in terms of the business value of that, there's no excuse. But like I was saying, if you are in it, the pathology of the organization, if they do not understand the value of logging, their application will suck and it will grind through developers. Because like I said, bugs are a form of psychological warfare. Nothing will bring you down by you don't get to innovate, you solve bugs, you are only a support programmer. And then if you get into the situation where you have nested bugs and the outer layer of those bugs can never be solved because the political climate is, oh, we're going to replace that in a year, or that's going away, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that there's no value in testing. There's lots and lots and lots of value in testing, but there's a lot more, to your point earlier, there's a lot more cost in building and maintaining those tests and continuing to extend those tests and figuring out figuring out where you're going to allocate your time on those tests. I mean, there's the tests will have value to your organization and to you, but does the value of building and maintaining those tests outweigh the building of a new feature that's going to net your company $1 million a year? Probably not. but you know what? You probably already have a logging framework plugged in, and so you go logger.warn for one level, logger.info for another level, and you set your environments to whichever level you want. You've got your source of truth.
I mean, you can imagine a scenario where you as a programmer roll into a new job and some other programmers, some intermediate programmers, whatever, wrote 100 unit tests. 30 of them are now failing. Do you really want to go in there and resolve the problems with those 30 unit tests?
Well, I think it's deeper than that, though. Somebody in your organization has written 100 unit tests. Did they test the right thing? Do you want to spend? It doesn't matter if you've got 100 unit tests if all you're doing is testing whether C#'s property access is working. Right. Right? I've seen tests like that. We're not testing our application. We're testing to see whether or not we can set a property on a class properly. That doesn't help anybody anywhere.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so there's all of this additional overhead that goes with maintaining that. Whereas, I'm going to rest pretty assured that I'm gonna rest pretty assured that Microsoft or in the .NET world or whatever, the V8 engine and the JavaScript world is actually going to set the property correctly. I'm pretty certain that that's gonna happen.
And I would have served with you on the logging train. In one of my previous jobs that I was at for 7 years, we had a rotating role called the firefighter. And their job for the whole
I like
week
that name.
was to just plow through all the support tickets. You were on call, you got called at 3 a.m. in the morning. And the worst thing that could ever happen to you is unhandled exception. That's your ticket,
That's
unhandled
the
exception.
best.
And I would get on the other developers. I'm like, okay, so your team doesn't have to do this, and you think it's acceptable to just not even put logging in? You get 0 logs, poor exception handling, and I would get on them because logging is your #1 tool. When I have to go in there and I don't have a log file to read, I have no idea what the application has done, where it died, anything that's going on.
Yeah.
I want verbose
I was
logging.
debating. I had one of my colleagues today was working with some of our search API, and it was the API was returning an error about, and it was descriptive error about what was going wrong, and he was saying, well, it should be doing this. I don't know. It should be doing this, and so I went. What did I do? I went to our server logs and I found where in the access log the query string was posted. Hey, look, it's missing that value.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I wanted to point
log
out,
in before.
if you have 30 unit tests failing, it's probably one thing. Like if you ever just you can't talk without coming up here. I just want to point out, because if I start seeing things starting to take a dump, I know that one thing has changed. And so systemic failures, start asking yourself, try to look at the bigger picture. I just wanted to bring it up that if you try back up from the problem, back up from the one error that you're seeing, and ask yourself, okay, what other angles might this be coming from?
But the power of logging, I mean,
Determine if it's a normal thing.
it doesn't matter which
Big
tech stack
combination.
you're working on either. That's the thing. Like,
Yeah.
how hard is a console log, right? Like, how long is a write line? It's something that's natural in every environment you can work in. And so if you can understand even the principles, you want to start bringing in logging frameworks. The logging frameworks, there's very little variance between what you'd see in a Java environment, an Erlang environment, a .NET environment, a JavaScript environment. It's the same structure. There's no additional overhead. There's no additional mental cycles you need to distribute to learning this thing. You can just build it into your toolkit, and it gives you so much return on an investment that you really have no way to look to avoid that.
And you have to be verbose. If I don't know what variables are going in, I don't know what to look for.
Anywhere that you have try catch, there should be a log inside of the
Absolutely. And I need to know what variables I'm working with, because some of our better applications, it's always, okay, I'm processing this record, I'm processing this record, I'm processing, boom, it blows up. Well, I know exactly what record I look at. Okay, hop into the database because I'm familiar with what's going on, look in there, oh, here's a row with a null price value. I know exactly what this failed.
Right.
Oh, unhandled exception? Okay, let me go spend 5 hours debugging this application, line by line, until I find out
Yeah. If we have an exception, we log it, and along with the descriptive message for that error, we also capture the call stack in our server logs. So,
Then all the detail you can possibly get.
then hey, now I don't have to guess. Yes, the user clicked this button in the UI. Which UI were they in? Like, was it our Android app? Was it our web app? Was it our iOS app? Was it our was it our player app? Well,
Yeah.
I don't care because I've got the log message there. It tells me all of the details of it. I know exactly which route it was going to. I know exactly what parameters were sent in.
Another thing that I've seen vendors do, don't log bogus errors. We had one vendor application where we had to write the most horrendous Splunk queries because they were spitting out 1,000 bogus errors every, 2-3 minutes. You couldn't look at their logs. You saw this, and it's like error, info, and it's like 90% of the log was pure bogus fluff.
Yeah. Log responsibly.
Yeah, and then you'd see third-party things pop up and say, "Oh, we closed your connection for you."
Well,
We'll start
we've
closing
run
it.
into, and this is something where the logging frameworks are really good on a lot of this stuff. I'd love to get some opinions about whether you use log aggregators. There's the ones that you just send your logging to.
We use one every day.
And I want to learn more about that because it sounds fascinating. But I use application insights on this one application, and It's really good at getting counts of things, so you don't litter a database. But I do, speaking of why I said log responsibly, is I have found it useful in some scenarios to, in your logger logic, is usually you want to build a logging class, or a logging service, and then call that, just change console write line, right, to whatever your logging instance is and inject it. But the key being, have some intelligence in there about whether something's a common one, so that you don't go and put in a million entries.
But I think it depends on your, it entirely depends on your environment, because what's important to me to see in a log as I'm actively developing a feature is not the same. It's definitely a different it's a subset, or it's a superset. It's a superset of what I want to see in my production log. Like, I want to see a whole lot more level of detail. So in my JavaScript node applications, I'm using Winston for logging, and it defines 7 different log levels. And I can log things. The most verbose level is not called verbose. That's the second from the top. They've got one called silly. So if I want to see just obscene amounts of detail as I'm actively developing a feature, I can log at silly, and then when I'm in production, maybe I'll cap it at info. Yeah. And the size of those logs drop, but there's things that are much more important as I'm debugging, that I can see those, and those get surfaced, and generally I'm working with one client making API requests instead of 10,000 clients making API requests. It's not getting mixed in. I don't have to worry about log filtering.
And speaking of that, so speaking of logs, just to bring this together a little bit, at least in Azure, and I'm sure Amazon's got something similar, you can actually set alerts based on the logging. That's an application insight. So you can say, look, if I get more than N errors in the course of a minute, an alert needs to go out.
So we do. You talked about log aggregators. So in our environment, we host everything AWS, Elastic Beanstalk, and the infrastructure management on that. Every single level of that generates its own logs, and they all have value at different parts. Are we trying to diagnose a problem connecting the load balancer to the Nginx instance on one particular S3 instance or EC2 instance? So all of those things come in, and we get those all aggregated. We transport those to an aggregator called LogDNA, and that allows us to set up those types of alerts. We can filter. We can set up just down to, we want to, in this view, we care about these log sources, and again, it's that unified view that we can see exactly how things are coming in, and if we don't care to watch WebSocket traffic, we can filter that out.
Sounds like Splunk. We would do the same thing. We'd say, these prod instance nodes for this application, if it spits out this exact error, it logs every 5 minutes. Ops has to 24/7. Ops team has to call us immediately because that means it's trash.
And I generally want to go for the simplest solution on these things. Again, I'm constantly battling complexity, and I think a lot of the tools that we start adding into our environments are just unnecessarily making an already complex problem more complex. And so, there are plenty of logging frameworks that will log to databases and whatnot. Guess what? That's another moving part. You know what? If I'm you have to set up an entire infrastructure to support your logging ecosystem if you're logging to a database, because if something goes wrong with your main database and you're trying to log to the main database, guess what? Your logging ain't gonna work. So I want to take my logs and I want to escalate them to the console. Any of these environments, Azure, AWS, they're going to give you rolling logs.
Well, I think so I hear you. I think it all depends on the transaction volume of your application. So, for example, if you're like Amazon, just that kind of transaction volume, you're not going to log to a database. You're going to log to a logging solution. And it's probably going to be, geo-replicated and blah, 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 because it just simply can't handle the transaction.
The number of applications I've worked on or been exposed to that were trying to do more complex solutions like logging to a database, logging to the database caused more problems than it solved.
Yeah, if you're sharing that database resource. If you're going to log the database, you need to have dedicated database.
And why are we logging? The whole reason that we're logging is so we can diagnose problems. We're not trying to cause problems.
And so this is one other thing I'd like to point out, because your log can also be an issue for maintenance. So one thing I found was we had turned on logging. I don't know, like I had added it to look at some stuff. This is my fault, right? This was years ago when I didn't know better or wasn't thinking about it at the time, right? Yeah, today, and we had been logging in this one database for years, and there must have been, millions of rows with no, maybe tens of millions of rows with no index, and the reason was that there were so many entries because not only there were that many errors, it was mainly an event log, and really the only events that we really recorded was an exception. But we also had all the time jobs were recording every time they executed, whether they had anything to process or not, which is every minute of every day, every week, every year, right? And across just thankfully only a single instance, but that adds up really quickly. And the problem is that when you try finding any issues, you would try going to back up the database, and it would, 4 hours later you would give up. Because what would happen is it would try to get a lock on that table, and what happens, it can't get a lock, so what's it start doing? It says, hey, I gotta do a backup, and it starts immediately writing to the log, right? The transaction log, if you understand how SQL works. So the transaction log, for the time it took to back up that table, a minute would pass, and you'd have to have one more entry into the transaction log. So it's one more minute that you have to wait. So you would never get a copy of the database. So finally, the solution was, well, before you do a backup, truncate the log. Because you can't do a delete. If you did a delete, you would have to take all millions of rows and write a single log entry for every single one of them. And if you're on a basic level SQL instance, you have a very small DTU. So, you would shut the whole production system down. If you were, on QA, you would shut QA down. Production, you would also stop production because all your DTUs were going towards writing to the T-log. So be really careful writing to the database as a log. The moral of that story.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that made me think about was is to consider the reason why you're logging too, because there are different reasons that you might want to log things, and those different reasons can drive you to potentially implementing different logging solutions. Maybe it is appropriate to log it to a database. Our traffic log, that's transient, right? I care about it for a day or two, maybe. Maybe I need to look at something a week old, but that's about the extent of it. But if we're trying to look, again, we go back to my company's domain, we do care about some data more point in time for a longer time period. And not only does it have to be just, we're not gonna just necessarily look for a particular line item, like what was this request made? We're going to look at more complex relations between log messages. We're gonna need to query, we're gonna need to see more context around that, in which case, that's probably something we would want to put in a database, and in fact we do in a lot of cases. If this is something that, with the nature of our business, we play licensed music, we have to report back to Sound Exchange what we play so we can pay the appropriate royalties on those so we don't get sued out of existence. Well, guess what? We need to keep a log of that information, and we need to query that, we need to aggregate that. If we're looking at our device health, we don't care what that device health was a year ago. We don't care what it was 60 days ago. So as we log to the database for queryability purposes, we'll also put like a TTL index on there and let MongoDB clean it up 45 days from now.
So do you think the database is the best place to keep that stuff now? Or do you think an external service?
Probably over time, an external service right now.
The reason I bring it up is why take a resource that you may use for your main environment and tie it up with logging. Unless you use a separate database.
Or if disk performance isn't a problem, just log disk and make sure you use a logging tool that rolls. I mean, set it to 5 meg logs and roll it for
strong infrastructure for reporting off of the database.
Yeah, I don't think you can use like file logging.
No, but you can.
If you have multiple users of the same application.
I mean, and over time, as
Because
any
you couldn't
solution
write it,
grows,
you'd
right?
never get a lock in
Right.
the file.
But as any
Right.
solution grows, you're going to reevaluate how it's being
Yeah.
done.
I
And
say
at some point, like the volume of data that we're going to be trying to capture in
Right.
certain things, it's probably going to end up in a queued solution. You know,
Yeah,
throw
I'm saying
this
that
in a
it's
queue.
so,
Yeah.
it's so common these days to have free access to logging services anyway. It's almost like silly not to use them. I love that there's something called silly as a logging mode.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's amazing.
Because a lot of our server client
We have 4
applications
minutes.
just
I'm gonna
rolled on.
remove one chair.
Yeah, this is what we did. We just then Splunk would scoop all the log files together.
Yep. Yeah, every time, that's what I'm
But
going to
never-
be doing tonight. We're doing a deployment. It's a mobile application. All of our players in the field need to get updated. We need to monitor. And so guess what I'm going to be spending an hour or two doing is watching logs.
Yeah, and that was one thing we had to be really careful about was any implementation we
Did you get
used
a
had to
ticket?
be able to
Who didn't get a ticket while you're talking?
be able to aggregate everything and set
well.
specifically 80 logs, 10 megs a piece, because we had this problem with one of our vendor applications where that wasn't defined. I don't know what happened to it, and its logging went insane. Chewed up, I don't know, 1 terabyte of disk space in less than 4 hours. We didn't know what it was doing, and so we came in the next morning, whole system, warehouse system had crashed because it just chewed up every shred of disk space with the logging. It just went haywire, and we look in that directory and it's just like, log as far as you could LS in that
Oops.
directory. I'm just like, delete. Okay, we're gonna have a chat with them about this. And I'm like, why did they just leave unbounded logging? That's one mistake I've seen a lot of developers make when they're just like, oh, I'm just gonna do my own logging in here, and they don't think about, they write logs, a year goes by, and you have this director, huge verbose logging. I'm like, we don't need any of this. Use log4j, inlog, something where you're just like truncate your logs.
Let it clean it up. Yes.
We don't need this, really. If we need these, get G's of it, stick it somewhere, archive it. We have that storage run somewhere, just shove it there, it's really great.
I mean, yeah, to me, it doesn't matter how much unit testing you've got in place. It's not, it can help you reach a better solution, but you're never going to consider all the angles. And the best place to debug is in production. We all know that, because that's what your users are doing every single day. So being able to glean as much information as you can. You're not going to be sitting at a debugger when your application is deployed to 12 instance Elastic Beanstalk setup. Like, which instance did this hit? Do we have sticky sessions on? No, it doesn't matter. When we get the logs, we capture it. It tells us where to look.
The only truly important unit test is some kind of happy vacuum test. Does this regression test fine? Does it blow up? No? Well, then we just assume that the developer did their own sort of unit testing when we rolled this out. If you do automated testing, that's great. That's really hard to maintain in larger applications. You really have to work at it. If you're not a big shop focused on development, if you're not a big shop blowing money, you're not going to pull it off.
All right, 1 minute.
It's just hard to do. So unit testing is awesome, but logging is where it's at. Because having been in that firefighter role, I know when you don't have that right logging, you get called at 3 a.m. in the morning. Your 3 to 8 a.m. is reverse engineering some mission critical application to find out why did this fail. It ends up being one field in the database that got bad data in because a business user fat fingered. We put a UPC instead of a price. They scanned the UPC instead of a price out in the warehouse, and you're like, okay, I gotta update this to $3. That's it. We spent 5 hours doing that because the developer was like, I'm just lazy. That's just what it is. Logging is your most important thing.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Woo!
Hey, that was Monday.
Hey.